The sea whispered like an old conspirator, carrying the taste of salt and dust into the morning air. Across the shimmering line where water met horizon, hammers struck stone, their rhythm harsh and unyielding. The sound was not the music of creation, but the dirge of a city's slow undoing. Each echo carried across the waves and into the walls of Tyre, where anxious defenders listened with clenched jaws and fearful hearts. They knew that every blow carved away their isolation, every stone hauled by trembling hands brought their enemy closer. For Alexander's men had resolved to do the impossible, to drag the land itself into the sea, to turn the waves into a road, to make the island fortress of Tyre an extension of the shore. On the mainland, soldiers and laborers, peasants and craftsmen pressed into service, bent their bodies beneath broken columns and shattered beams. They lifted the carcasses of ruined buildings and carted them toward the shoreline. Debris from fallen temples, splintered doors from abandoned homes, the very bones of the land itself became the mortar of conquest. Sweat mingled with salt spray, cloaks stiffened in the cold air, and muscles burned with unending toil. The smell of wet earth and old timber mixed with brine, creating an atmosphere both sacred and suffocating. It was as though the land and sea had conspired to birth something monstrous, a causeway of ruin stretching into the deep. Alexander watched from his vantage, the wind tangling through his hair, his gaze fixed on the half-formed line of rubble inching toward Tyre. His cloak snapped in the salt wind, its folds heavy with dampness, but his eyes betrayed no doubt. For him, this was not merely a siege. It was a statement to gods and mortals alike. Walls, seas, traditions of invincibility. None would withstand the will he carried. He was not content to batter gates or starve defenders. He would reshape the world beneath their feet, bind the sea itself to his ambition, and force Tyre to surrender to inevitability. Yet for those who labored on the growing causeway, the vision was less divine and more suffocating. They felt the drag of stone against shoulder, the sting of salt water against open wounds, the groan of timbers splitting under weight. The causeway was a beast with a hunger that never ceased, devouring men's strength, swallowing the mainland's ruins, and stretching relentlessly toward the island. At night, when fires dimmed and silence threatened, the men would look out to the black water, lapping at their day's work. They could almost hear the sea's laughter, mocking their audacity, whispering promises that the tide would reclaim all they had built. Inside Tyre, watchmen leaned over the battlements, their hands gripping cold stone as they peered at the monstrous road approaching. Each day it crept nearer, like a serpent of rubble slithering across the waves. The Tyrians whispered prayers in Phoenician tongues to Melkart, their city's god, begging for the sea to shield them as it had shielded their ancestors for centuries. The island had been their sanctuary, their unbreachable haven, the stone jewel set apart from the shore. Now that sanctuary was shrinking. The smoke of their altars rose into skies already darkened by the dust of Alexander's works. The gods themselves seemed distant, their silence as heavy as the stones hauled into the sea. Among the laborers, a boy no older than 15 strained beneath a length of timber, his bare feet slipping on wet sand. His breath came ragged, each gasp tasting of salt and blood. When he stumbled, another man steadied him, whispering, "Do not fall. If you fall, the sea will take you." The boy's eyes widened, not from fear of drowning, but from the knowledge that the work would never end. Each sunrise brought more rubble, more lashings of whips to hurry the pace, more prayers unanswered as their sweat watered the sea. For them, the causeway was not a path to glory, but a chain binding them to exhaustion, sacrifice, and nameless graves. The sound of hammers never ceased. Even gulls abandoned their cries, driven away by the relentless thunder of men remaking the shore. From Tyre's walls, defenders loosed arrows into the laboring masses, their shafts whistling through the salt air. Some found their mark, dropping men into the surf, their bodies dragged quickly beneath. Yet still the work continued. Still the line crept forward, as if death itself could not slow the monstrous advance. Every corpse swallowed by the waves seemed only to strengthen Alexander's resolve. Another offering to the sea in exchange for dominion. Night fell heavy and thick, cloaking the causeway in darkness. But even then, the work continued. Torches burned along the line of rubble, their flames smudged by fog. The smell of pitch and damp stone filled the air, mingling with the groans of men too weary to lift, but too afraid to stop. The sea lapped at their ankles, a cold hand forever reminding them of the abyss they sought to tame. Shadows moved across the half-finished road, not just of men, but of something greater. Ambition given form, cruelty born of resolve. In the quiet between hammer strikes, one could hear the waves sighing, as though the sea itself mourned the audacity of men. When dawn returned, the causeway stretched farther, a jagged scar across the waters. It was no longer a work of rubble alone, but a symbol of intrusion, of defiance against nature and against the gods. Tyre's defenders could see it clearly now, their sanctuary shrinking, their isolation bleeding into inevitability. Each new stone added to the causeway was not merely a step forward, it was a bell tolling, a funeral dirge for the island's ancient invulnerability. And so the sea bore witness as the land was forced into its depths, as men reshaped what should not be reshaped, as Alexander's will carved across the horizon. Tyre's stand had only just begun. But already the sound of hammers was louder than prayer. Already the line between defiance and doom had begun to blur. The wind carried the salt across both camps, across the weary laborers on the causeway and the defenders waiting within their walls. It carried the truth that this was not merely war, but transformation. The world itself was being reshaped, and in its reshaping, something sacred was being lost. And as the hammers fell again, echoing like heartbeats across the sea, the causeway crept forward, pulling both conqueror and conquered toward the inevitable silence of what was to come. Before dawn broke, the sea was already aflame. Torches lined the growing scar of Alexander's causeway, their light shivering against damp stone and timber, their smoke rising into the twilight like omens. The air was thick with the smell of pitch, resin, and sweat, a bitter perfume of exhaustion and fire. Along the half-formed bridge, men labored under leather shields, bent spines glistening with salt, while the sound of hammer against nail mingled with the hiss of waves and the groan of heavy timbers sinking into the sea. The causeway was no longer just rubble and stone. It had become a living creature, born of dust and ruin, creeping inexorably toward the island of Tyre. But from the towering walls of the city, fire answered fire. Tyrian defenders leaned into the night's chill, their faces lit by the glow of braziers, their hands steady as they hurled flaming missiles onto the causeway. Arrows whistled down in arcs of death, their shafts glinting briefly before vanishing into flesh or sand. Rafts, smeared with tar, floated forward like shadows, set ablaze and loosed against Alexander's monstrous road. When they struck, the water roared with sparks, and the timbers shuddered, erupting in smoke thick as storm clouds. The causeway became a furnace, men coughing black soot from their lungs as flames licked at rawhide shields and climbed the towers erected to protect their progress. In the chaos, the torches flickered and blurred, casting elongated shadows that danced across the water like specters of the drowned. The men who built this path knew the risk of every stone laid. They carried on under a rain of fire, binding wood and earth into a bridge that seemed always on the edge of collapse. Some cursed the sea for its cruelty, swallowing their comrades when the timbers splintered. Others muttered prayers to forgotten gods, voices hoarse and drowned by the clash of fire and stone. Alexander himself, standing on the shore, did not waver. His words carried above the storm, not soft encouragement, but commands as sharp as spears. His will was iron, demanding obedience even from the waves. The Tyrians fought not with steel alone, but with cunning born of desperation. Their rafts of fire turned night into an inferno, waves shimmering red as though the sea itself had bled. Each strike against the causeway was a cry of defiance, a refusal to bow to the earthbound ambition that sought to chain their sanctuary to the mainland. Women within the city wailed in prayer as the clash carried into the night, their voices mingling with the crackle of burning wood. The defenders poured molten pitch from the walls, and the smell was unbearable, scorched flesh, tar boiling, water hissing in rage as fire met sea. Still the causeway grew. The men of Alexander's army did not falter, though every inch was bought with blood. They dragged new beams into place, lashed timbers with ropes soaked in seawater, and shoveled gravel onto smoldering gaps. Their eyes stung, their throats raw with smoke, yet the work did not stop. In their labor was both fear and faith. The fear of Alexander's wrath, the faith in his vision that no wall, no sea, no god could deny. Each strike of hammer and thrust of spade was an act of survival, of defiance against the impossible. From the walls, the Tyrians watched the fiery road inch closer. For centuries they had trusted the sea to guard them, the waves their moat, the deep their fortress. Now that sanctuary was being stolen, stone by stone, under a canopy of fire. The crackle of flames and the shouts of soldiers became their constant litany, a hymn of doom echoing through streets once filled with incense and trade. Children were roused from sleep by the roar of catapults. Mothers pressed them to their chests, whispering that Melkart would protect them. Yet the gods' silence stretched long, broken only by the hiss of burning rafts. The night stretched into a fevered eternity until smoke dulled even the stars. On the causeway, men stumbled forward in shadows blurred by soot, their hands blistered, their armor blackened. They worked as if possessed, feeding the creature of stone and fire that reached for Tyre. In their movements was desperation, but also a strange kind of reverence, as though the causeway itself had become a shrine to human will, demanding sacrifice without promise of mercy. When the fires died back with the coming dawn, the ruin was clear. Charred beams smoldered, and the water glistened with oil and ash. Yet the causeway remained, battered but alive, stretching farther than it had the day before. Its survival was both triumph and omen, a promise that Alexander's ambition was greater than fire, greater than the sea itself. The Tyrians, exhausted from their night's defense, looked upon it with dread. The island that had stood inviolate for centuries was no longer untouchable. The serpent of stone was crawling closer, undeterred by flame or prayer. And so the day began with silence, heavier than war. Smoke drifted lazily over the waters, carrying with it the scent of ruin. Both sides stared across the gulf, knowing the struggle was far from over. The Tyrians clutched their weapons. The Macedonians rebuilt their shields, and the causeway stretched between them like a grim prophecy. The sun climbed, pale and unfeeling, over a scene blackened with soot. For Tyre, it was a reminder that their sanctuary was bleeding away. For Alexander, it was a promise that the impossible had already begun to break. And in the smoke that lingered above the water, one could almost see the shape of what was to come. Towers rising, engines wheeled forward, and the final assault waiting like a shadow on the horizon. The morning broke with a strange brilliance, as though the heavens themselves wished to sanctify the stones of Tyre. Sunlight spilled across the towering battlements, gilding their crests in radiant fire, while the causeway stretched toward them like a scar across the sea. Yet within that beauty, there trembled an unspoken dread. The air was alive with the groan of timbers, the clang of hammer upon nail, the muttered prayers of men straining to raise engines of war against walls, said to be the dwelling place of gods. From the mainland, Alexander's siege towers rose. Colossal wooden beasts sheathed in hides, their flanks blackened with pitch, their bellies stuffed with catapults and archers. As dawn touched their peaks, they seemed less the work of men than the shadows of mountains dragged to the shore. Beneath them, the soldiers labored with eyes rimmed red from smoke and salt. They nailed planks into place with blistered hands. Their backs bent beneath the weight of beams that smelled of resin and sea rot. Sweat streaked across faces already darkened with soot, while the constant hiss of waves battered the foundations of their road. Each tower groaned like a wounded ox as ropes tightened and pulleys strained, their massive frames inching forward across the rubble-strewn causeway. The smell of damp leather, soaked in brine to resist the Tyrians' fire, clung heavy in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of iron and the sour musk of men who had long since forgotten rest. From Tyre's ramparts, the defenders watched, their hearts caught between awe and terror. These walls had stood inviolate for generations, a crown of stone upon the sea, kissed by the hands of Melkart himself. Yet now the horizon was broken by these towering creations of mortal defiance, engines that promised to tear open what gods had sealed. Archers lined the parapets, their bows straining, their arrows dipped in oil, their eyes fixed on the lumbering towers below. They hurled stones, they poured molten pitch, their voices raised not in song but in shouts of desperation. Every impact rang like thunder, but still the towers advanced, crawling forward on wheels that ground against the rubble of the causeway. It was a contest not of armies alone, but of faith and audacity. Tyre clung to the belief that the sea and its walls were eternal, that Melkart would not abandon his chosen city. Alexander's men, driven by their king's relentless will, labored under a vision that no wall, no god, no sea could endure against mortal determination. Between these two beliefs, wood and stone clashed in a storm of fire and shadow. Siege engines hurled stones that shrieked through the air before striking the walls with a sound like mountains breaking. In answer, Tyrian defenders rained destruction downward, their missiles setting fire to the hides that cloaked the towers, their curses echoing like incantations against ambition itself. The men within the towers coughed through smoke, their eyes stung with salt and flame, yet still they cranked their winches, still they loosed their bolts. From within the wooden wombs, arrows flew outward, striking defenders on the parapets, silencing prayers with screams. The towers became living things, groaning, burning, bleeding men and smoke. And still they pressed forward, inexorable, like fate carved in timber and iron. From the harbor, Tyrian ships surged forth, their oars biting into the water, their decks bristling with soldiers. They lashed burning rafts to the causeway, the sea erupting in waves of fire. The smoke coiled upward in black pillars, blotting out the sun, wrapping both attacker and defender in a shroud of ash. Yet even in that furnace, the towers did not stop. Men dragged them forward with ropes slung across shoulders already raw, their sandals slipping on the charred stones, their breath ragged with desperation. They worked as though they carried not towers, but destiny itself. As the clash reached its height, a strange silence fell within the city's heart. Priests stood before the altar of Melkart, their robes heavy with ash, their voices raised in chants meant to bind the god once more to his people. They lit incense, though its fragrance was lost beneath the stench of burning pitch. They lifted their hands toward the walls, but the stone trembled with each impact, and in that trembling, the faithful felt the weight of doubt. Could gods bleed? Could their sanctuary crumble before the hands of men? On the causeway, Alexander watched the battle with eyes that did not waver. His cloak whipped in the wind, his face shadowed by fire's glow. To his men, he was no longer simply a king. He was the embodiment of inevitability, the iron will that pressed forward even as the sea and the city conspired against him. He saw the towers burn, saw his men fall, and yet he did not call them back. For him, every beam consumed, every life given, was a sacrifice upon the altar of conquest. He did not believe in the inviolability of walls or gods. He believed only in the relentlessness of will, and in that belief the towers kept advancing. By nightfall, the walls still stood, scarred but unbroken, their parapets blackened with soot, their defenders weary but defiant. The towers, too, remained, some charred, some broken, but others still pressing forward, inch by inch, across the ruin of the causeway. Between them lay a battlefield transformed into an altar of fire and blood, where faith and defiance mingled with smoke. The sea hissed against the stones, swallowing the ash and the fallen alike, as though eager to erase the memory of men's audacity. And yet the causeway remained. The towers remained. The will of Alexander remained. Tyre's walls trembled, not from collapse, but from the certainty that collapse would one day come. The god's silence hung heavy, and in that silence, men on both sides felt the shifting of an age. As darkness claimed the sky, the torches along the causeway flickered once more, their glow casting long shadows upon the walls. Those shadows whispered of what was to come, the breach, the blood, the sacrifices yet to be made. And as the sea lapped at the charred remains of the day's battle, it carried with it the quiet truth that even divine walls, once thought eternal, could one day crumble beneath the hands of men. The breach came not with a trumpet's call, but with the groan of wood and the shatter of stone. Smoke curled along the walls of Tyre, clinging to the air like a curse, while the sea below carried the echo of screams into the salt-heavy wind. For 7 months the city had stood, battered yet unbroken, but now its southern harbor trembled beneath the weight of Alexander's fury. Siege engines creaked forward, their timbers moaning like beasts pressed to their last strength, while catapults hurled stones that splintered against the once sacred walls. The sound was relentless, a rhythm of destruction that matched the beating of terrified hearts within the city. The Tyrians fought with desperate resolve. From the ramparts, defenders hurled stones and burning pitch, their bodies straining against exhaustion. their faith anchored in the walls that had shielded generations. The air shimmered with fire and salt, arrows whistling downward like dark rain, shields splintering beneath the impact. But the breach widened with every strike, a wound in stone that no prayer could heal. The walls, once a crown upon the sea, began to fracture like brittle bone. And through that wound came the roar of Macedonian soldiers, surging as though carried by the tide itself. The harbor, once a sanctuary of commerce and song, now lay drowned in fire. Ships groaned at their moorings, some already burning, their sails curled into black husks against the sky. Families who had hidden in courtyards now pressed into shadows. Mothers clutching children beneath crumbling arches, whispering prayers not for victory, but for mercy. The smell of ash and salt water filled every breath, while dust from the collapsing walls coated lips and tongues until speech became a rasp. The city that had stood untouchable for centuries was unraveling in hours, its heartbeat muffled beneath the thunder of war. Through the breach pressed men armored in bronze, their faces smeared with soot, their eyes hollow from months of labor and blood. They did not enter as conquerors adorned with laurels, but as storm and fire, driven forward by the will of their king. Their boots struck against broken stone, their swords flashed in narrow alleys where priests once carried offerings, their torches set alight the chambers where incense had risen to the gods. The invasion was not merely physical, it was sacrilege. The sacred became profane in the space of a single heartbeat. In the shadows of a collapsed courtyard, a child's sandal lay abandoned, half buried in dust, the leather straps frayed and brittle. It was a small thing, insignificant against the clash of armies, but it spoke of innocence torn away, of lives trampled beneath ambition's march. A mother's cry rose above the din, sharp and unbroken, a sound that clung to the stones even as fire consumed them. These were the sacrifices of conquest, nameless and voiceless, carried into silence by the smoke drifting over the sea. Alexander advanced behind his soldiers, his gaze fixed not on the suffering, but on the breach itself, the physical manifestation of his will. For him, every stone toppled was a testament to inevitability, every scream the price of empire's birth. His figure stood against the haze, cloak snapping in the wind, face half lit by flame. To his followers, he was the hand of fate. To his enemies, he was the shadow that consumed gods and sanctuaries alike. His silence was heavier than command, for it carried the truth that surrender was no longer possible. Within Tyre, the lines between defiance and despair blurred. Some citizens took up arms, fighting with knives and shattered tools, their hands slick with sweat and dust. Others collapsed to their knees in prayer, eyes fixed on the sky that offered no answer. The city had become a crucible of sacrifice, every soul caught between loyalty to a fading past and the crushing weight of the present. The breach was more than a hole in stone. It was a doorway into oblivion, a passage from pride into ruin. The sea, eternal witness, lapped against the causeway with indifferent rhythm, its waves carrying fragments of wood and cloth, pieces of lives undone. The salt air mingled with the copper tang of blood, with the acrid smoke of pitch still burning in the harbor. Above, gulls circled silently, their cries muted, as if the very sky refused to disturb the weight of tragedy. The world seemed to hold its breath, watching a city once radiant with trade and faith collapse into dust beneath ambition's heel. By dusk, the breach had swallowed Tyre's defenses. The city's songs were gone, replaced by the crackle of fire devouring timber, by the sobs of captives pressed against shattered walls. Yet amid the ruin lay fragments of defiance, stones hurled from trembling hands, prayers carved into the air with voices that refused to die unheard. The sandal in the dust, the cry of a mother, the silent gaze of a child, all lingered like shadows, refusing to be erased by flame. And so the breach became not only an end, but a threshold. A passage into grief, yes, but also into the deeper reckoning that would follow. The sea still whispered against the stones, carrying the story outward, carrying the memory into the ears of those who would come after. For what had been lost in Tyre was not only a city, but the illusion that any wall, however sacred, could remain forever unbroken. As night fell, the fire's glow bled into the waves, turning the sea into a mirror of flame. The torches flickered along the causeway once more, and in their light the soldiers pressed deeper into the city. Behind them, shadows clung to the breach, silent witnesses to sacrifice. Ahead of them lay temples, courtyards, lives yet to be claimed. And in that silence, one could already sense the shape of what was to come. The mourning within the temple's ruins, the hollow prayers of priests kneeling before gods who could no longer protect them. The smoke still lingered when Alexander entered the temple. It clung to the columns like a veil, curling around the fractured capitals, trailing through the air where incense had once risen in fragrant prayer. The floor was slick with ash, its once polished stone dulled by soot, by blood, by grief. Outside, the city roared with the sounds of conquest, boots on broken streets, the sharp crack of doors forced open, the muffled wail of captives pulled into the shadows. But here, inside these walls, once consecrated to Melkart, there was only silence, heavy and suffocating, like the last breath held before a final tolling bell. The light filtered faintly through the smoke, painting the temple's interior in shades of gray and fading gold. Where once offerings had burned in solemn ritual, now splintered timbers smoldered, their smoke acrid and bitter. Statues of gods stood fractured, their marble faces split by the weight of stone hurled against them, their gaze as blank as the heavens above. And kneeling at the altar, his hands trembling, was a priest, his robes stained with soot and tears. His voice rose in fragments, a whisper that cracked into silence, words begging for mercy, for deliverance, for a god who no longer answered. Alexander's steps echoed as he entered, the sound alien in a space built for reverence. His cloak was ash-stained, his hair damp with sea spray, his face illuminated by the dull flicker of surviving lamps. He looked upon the altar not with awe, but with the cold scrutiny of a conqueror measuring the spoils of faith. To his men, who followed with cautious reverence, he was more than king. He was the new arbiter of the sacred, a man whose will had breached walls believed eternal, whose ambition had silenced even the sea. They lowered their eyes as though to look upon him in that moment was to look upon something more than mortal. The priest did not rise, his knees pressed against cold stone, his hands clutched a relic, a fragment of an offering bowl, chipped, useless. He dared not meet Alexander's gaze. His lips formed words like shadows, invocations to Melkart, to ancestors, to the sea itself. He prayed that perhaps the god would yet stir, that flame might yet descend, that this silence might shatter into thunder. But no thunder came. Only the hush of a city's soul unraveling, only the presence of the conqueror who now claimed both flesh and faith. Alexander reached for the altar. His hand, dusted with ash, rested upon its surface. The stone was cool beneath his palm, its edges scarred by fire, its top littered with fragments of shattered offerings. He lingered there, as though weighing the weight of conquest, not in gold or captives, but in the desecration of something once untouchable. Did he feel triumph in that moment or burden? Did he sense the enormity of silencing gods, or did he see only another victory inscribed upon his endless march? History would not record his thought, only his presence, cloaked in silence, framed by smoke. Outside, the city groaned under its undoing. Mothers clutched their children as chains rattled, their cries swallowed by the roar of soldiers, dragging them into exile. The sea lapped indifferently at the harbor, carrying fragments of burned timbers, shards of helmets, and the echo of a city's grief. Tyre, once radiant, was now a shell of smoke and shadow, its heartbeat stilled, its temples defiled. The harbor that had welcomed merchants and pilgrims now reeked of ash, its waters darkened with ruin. Inside the temple, the priest's whisper faltered, his voice breaking into a sob. His hands shook as he pressed his forehead to the cracked stone, as though to cling to the last remnants of the divine. Around him, the silence deepened, a silence that seemed to stretch beyond stone and time, a silence that marked not only the end of Tyre's faith, but the end of an age. Alexander turned away, his cloak sweeping ash across the floor, his shadow lingering like a stain upon the sacred. He did not look back. The lamps sputtered in the smoke, their flames shrinking into dim embers, their light paling against the gloom. The priest's sobs echoed faintly, then faded into whispers, then into silence. The temple stood, but hollow, its god absent, its sanctity broken. It was no longer a place of prayer, but a monument to conquest, a vessel of memory turned into a tomb. And as Alexander stepped back into the light of the ruined courtyard, the weight of the temple remained behind him, pressing into the stone, into the ash, into the silence that would never be lifted. The city had lost more than walls, more than homes, more than lives. It had lost its soul, carried into silence by the conqueror's march. Above the city, smoke curled into the evening sky, drifting toward the horizon where the sun sank blood-red into the sea. The wind carried with it the faint scent of incense, twisted now with ash, a ghost of what had once been holy. And in that mingling of smoke and prayer, one could feel the sorrow of a people undone, the weight of faith crushed beneath ambition. The temple's silence was not the end, only a passage. For beyond the desecrated altars lay the harsher judgment still to come. The chains of exile, the endless march of captives across the causeway, the toll of voices silenced not by gods, but by men. The city's soul had been broken, but its people yet remained, bound to a fate as heavy as the stones that had once held their walls. The chains rattled first, a sound that split the silence of the smoldering city more cruelly than fire or steel. Iron links clanged against stone as men, women, and children were herded through Tyre's broken gates, their faces streaked with soot, their clothes stiff with salt and ash. The causeway that had once been an abomination of rubble and ruin now became their road of exile, a bridge not toward salvation, but into captivity. Each step echoed with finality, the sea's waves lapping indifferently at the stones beneath, as though mocking the city that had once trusted its waters as a shield. The sun hung low, heavy and red, casting its last glow across the faces of the defeated. A mother stumbled at the head of the column, her arms wrapped around a child asleep against her breast. Her eyes, hollow with exhaustion, flicked once toward the temple spires behind her, their tops fractured and smoking, then forward into the uncharted expanse of chains and uncertainty. Around her, the voices of children whimpered, their cries muted beneath the bark of soldiers urging them onward. The smell of burning timbers still clung to the air, mingled with the acrid tang of sweat and iron, pressing into lungs that had already endured too much. Behind the column, Alexander's men marched in order, their armor dark with soot, their expressions hard. They had fought like beasts, carried stones like slaves, and bled upon the causeway until it became a monument of their labor. Now they watched as the people of Tyre were driven across it, the conquered walking the very road that had undone them. Some soldiers sneered, others turned their eyes away, but none spoke. The silence of the captives was more deafening than their own victory songs. The sea, eternal and unmoved, whispered against the stones, carrying fragments of the city into its depths. Splinters of oars, shards of amphorae, ashes from homes that would never be rebuilt. It had once been Tyre's fortress, the moat that made its walls eternal, but now it bore witness to chains dragging across its edge. The causeway, born of defiance, had become a funeral path, its stones scarred by fire and by the footprints of the condemned. Among the captives, an old man carried nothing but a cracked tablet, its inscriptions half effaced by time. He clutched it like a relic, his lips moving in silence, tracing words that no conqueror could strip from him. Perhaps it was a prayer, perhaps a list of ancestors, perhaps only a memory given form. To him, it was more than stone. It was identity, the only piece of Tyre that could not be burned or chained. His eyes lifted once toward the sky, as if to ask whether the gods had abandoned them, or whether men had proven stronger than divinity itself. Alexander stood at the edge of the causeway, his cloak whipped by the wind, his gaze fixed not on the captives, but on the horizon. To him, this was not the end of Tyre, but another step on the march of empire. His eyes did not linger on the women weeping, nor the children dragging their bare feet against the stones. He saw only victory, only inevitability. Yet in his silence, the weight of what had been undone pressed invisibly against the air, the loss of a city that had stood for centuries, the silencing of voices that once prayed proudly within walls, now reduced to dust. The chains bit deeper as the march continued. The sound of metal striking stone became a hymn of defeat, a song carried on the wind across the harbor. Some captives tried to look back, but the sight only deepened despair. Black smoke curling into the sky, gulls circling above a city that no longer belonged to them. The temple's silence stretched like a wound, and the streets that had once thrummed with merchants and music were drowned now in ash and shadow. Tyre was no more. What remained were only its people, stripped of place, walking into exile. At the water's edge, children glanced sideways at the sea, its surface glittering faintly with the reflection of firelight. They had been born into a city that trusted those waters, a sanctuary held apart from the mainland. Now the sea was just another mirror of their grief, carrying their reflections outward into an indifferent horizon. For them, the causeway was not merely stone. It was betrayal made solid, a bridge that delivered them into the arms of captivity. And yet, amid the silence, defiance lingered. In the way the old man clutched his tablet, in the way the mother pressed her child's head firmly against her chest, shielding him from the sight of chains. In the way some captives raised their eyes not to the ground but to the heavens, whispering prayers that even silence could not erase. Tyre was fallen, but its soul had not vanished. It walked across the causeway in every bound hand, in every stubborn heartbeat that refused to yield. The march stretched long into the evening. Shadows fell across the causeway, lengthening into dark fingers that reached toward the shore. Torches burned along the path, their flames bending in the wind, casting light across faces both hardened and broken. The soldiers' voices grew hoarse from command, the captives' feet raw from stone, the chains heavy as eternity. And yet the column pressed on, step by step, breath by breath, carrying the last remnants of Tyre into a future written by others. As night deepened, the sea grew louder, its waves striking against the stones with the cadence of mourning. The sky, veiled in smoke, revealed no stars, only the dull glow of embers drifting above the ruined city. At the far end of the causeway, where the shore awaited, the captives hesitated, as though unwilling to let go of the sea that had defined their lives. But the chains pulled them forward, and the last thread of Tyre was severed. The causeway lay behind them, silent but eternal. A scar upon the sea, a monument to ambition carved in rubble and grief. It bore not only the weight of soldiers who had built it, but the footsteps of a people dragged from their sanctuary. And in that silence, one truth lingered. Conquest could tear down walls, desecrate temples, and scatter lives. But the memory of what had been endured would not vanish. It would travel with the captives, carried in whispers, in scars, in the ghostly rhythm of chains echoing against stone. And so the story did not end with fire or ruin, but with exile, with figures fading into the night, with a people torn from their city yet still carrying its soul. Ahead lay the unknown, slavery, scattering, silence, behind lay smoke and shadows, and between them stretched the causeway, a road of stones that bound land to sea, victory to sorrow, and history to memory.